Hello, welcome back once again to Entertainment Recast, the podcast offshoot of our YouTube channel, Entertainment Rebooted. I am John. I am joined, as usual, by my esteemed and overly energetic co-host, DJ. Say hello, DJ.
Hello.
All right, DJ. Today we are going to be talking about World War II, specifically World War II movies and series, with the upcoming release of the new miniseries Masters of the Air, which is a companion series to Band of Brothers and the Pacific. We will be talking about what World War II's grip is on Hollywood and filmmakers in general, considering that there are more than 4,900 World War II movies, TV episodes, short films, and miniseries. And it's estimated to be well over 300 days of content in total.
That's a lot of content.
That is a lot of content. Imagine a whole year, no sleep, just watching World War II films.
Can't think of a better way to spend my life.
Can't think of a better way to slowly die of dehydration and starvation. Anyway, so let's start this off with the question, why so many World War II films? Why do you think that is, DJ?
This one's actually really easy. Okay, so war films in general are popular because war is we as a people, we tend to be like attracted to like the macabre, but generally like war is just like this thing we don't understand. Motivations, like reasoning, the depravity of it, the depth and destruction that it can weave, I think interests people. Mm-hmm. And of all wars that we have to go over, World War II is a really interesting one, mm-hmm. because it is the most recent war that we've had that was large scale. It was, and it involved the pretty much the entire world was at war. But also, we think of it as clear moral guidelines. There's a good guy and there's a bad guy, and it's easy. World War I is a lot more complicated, which came right before it. How it happened, how it was ended, the politics of that war were insane.
Yeah.
A lot of the wars since World War II have either been like, another big one is a lot of these war movies are often American made, and so they show off like America. And, well, a lot of the wars after that we lost or went on forever, and there's not really any clear defined motive, goal. World War II is easy. Beat Hitler, stop the expansion.
Yeah.
Like, that was it.
Yeah, it's extremely
beat the Nazis. World War II was beat the Nazis, beat the Nazis, beat the Nazis. It's really easy objective. World War I didn't even have a clear objective. Everybody just was angry because Europe was at turmoil, and there was a lot of territorial disputes between the colonies that all the European countries had. There wasn't really any clear defined goal. That's it.
I also think that part of the reason that we don't have a lot of World War I films in particular is because America makes the majority of movies in the world, and we were only in the war for about the last year. So we don't have a lot of content that we're like, oh yeah, America, let's throw an American person.
We also didn't have a real stake in the game.
We
came to help our allies eventually because, I mean, you could say the Lusitania, but it doesn't really matter. Like, the real reason we got involved is because, like,
the Zimmerman telegram.
Yeah, well, yes. But we were pestered about it for a long time. But even then, we were war machining weapons for the Europe during the war anyway.
Well, yeah.
So, I mean, like, we were still involved. We just weren't directly involved. But World War II was like, Hitler's expansion was a real threat. It's not the first time. Napoleon's expansion in Europe was just as frightening for the time, but it wasn't as world compelling.
Yeah.
His expansion was pretty much Europe, and that's kind of where his goals lied. Hitler had his eyes set on the world, and without anybody in his heart, he would have continued to expand. And then there's the after effects, the Holocaust and Final Solution, and like just the sheer depravity of like what we learned after the fact makes it a stunning villain.
Yeah.
He's a true villain in the truest sense. Like the true mustache twirling villain he's the real life incarnation of that.
Right.
And so it makes a really clear goal: defeat Hitler, defeat the Nazis, They had harsh symbolism. They're easy to define. The Nazis and all the other wars, there really isn't a defining trait of the Nazis. Probably the most recognizable like war trait of any army that's ever existed. Like they just stood out in the way they handled themselves, and they did it on purpose. They did goose stepping. They were very pomp and circumstance and ceremonial, and they had a lot of symbolism, and it just stands out in so many ways.
That's fair.
Those are just a few, and it's a popular one to talk about. There's a lot of reasons.
Yeah. Personally, I think like some of the things that influence Hollywood specifically to make more World War II films is World War II is also like the first modern war. It was a completely different kind of warfare, even compared to World War One.
It's true.
So there's a lot of technological advancements. There's a lot of different strategies. And the other thing is that it was also the first war that the public was 100% aware of things that were happening. You had newsreels. You had the press was there taking footage, filming battles, taking interviews directly from the soldiers and sending them directly back. A lot of letters and things like that became publicized in national stories. And we're also in an era where movies were really starting to take off in Hollywood. Because if you think about it, Hollywood was relatively small up until about the 1930s, 1940s.
Yep.
And that's when movies started having voice, and you started having actual classic movie stars and big narratives and things like that. So what better way to get people involved and supporting the war effort than to film a World War II style film? So they started becoming popular during the war, and I think that it just kind of carried on as a sort of legacy, easy thing to film and have big dramatic moments and stuff like that.
You know
and it remains popular. It remains publicly important to this day.
That's the point to you. You mentioned the newsreels. One of the things that people say about the Vietnam War, it was like America's most unpopular war because it was filmed for the first time. It was the first time people knew the horrors of war. But that's not true. World War II showed a lot of the collateral damage, even in the newsreels. But we had a very strong enemy, and so there were anti-war people that spoke out against our involvement in World War II.
Yeah.
But they weren't popular. In World War II, defeating the Nazis was a common goal. It was like a big thing. It was propaganda was on the side of the war.
Yeah.
Vietnam was harder because there was no clear defined enemy, objective, or reason. It wasn't because we knew the horrors of war. If they wanted to, they could have made that war look like we were the heroes of disguise. Problem is, they couldn't make a good reason why we were there. So the collateral damage looked bad because it was just farmers and civilians we were fighting, not the Nazis.
Right. And also the news there was meant to be more, real slice of life, actual news. Like they were being true journalists. A lot of World War II, even the journalists are heavily censored at the time, and it's very clear that's like, okay, you need to film in this direction.
Yep.
Don't turn the camera around to us busting in the doors and pulling people out into the streets to interrogate where the enemies are. You focus on, look at how much destruction and devastation happened when the Nazis refused to leave the town.
Yep.
So it's really focused. So I think that's part of the reason, though, that I think that era specifically, like World War II, remains popular, is because, yes, there's a defined good guy, there's a defined bad guy. The newsreels and the public opinion of that war are still relatively positive even to this day, even as more things get revealed historically. We're like, well, it's justified. It's the nature of war.
Part of the problem that people have with war in general, and this goes to World War II, but just in World War II films, is that people don't understand war unless they've lived it. They just, and that's not everybody, but it's general. People just, they make these ideas like war could be avoided. We could have never got to it. There should never be collateral damage. That's just not realistic.
No.
War will always have collateral damage because when you're fighting a target, especially if you're fighting really wicked, evil people, they will use human shields. Often terrorist groups fight that way. They will put military targets in civilian neighborhoods, knowing that if the enemy shoots them, they could play the victim. And they'll parade out to the people, look at our poor dead children who they killed. Yeah, but you put a missile launcher on his house.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, you made yourself a war target. And people don't accept an answer. War is not as easy. It's not black and white. It's not simple. It's very messy. And when you're fighting, it carries over into civilian life. And that's just an unfortunate side effect of war. And I think war movies, especially, do a really good job of showing that. A lot of World War II films earlier on would just be about, yay, us versus them. But over time, World War II films got more nuanced and showed some of the collateral damage, the civilian stuff, the devastation, the people, what they went through. And that makes them interesting. But it's still easy to see that, well, it's really hard for you to argue we were wrong when you see what you were up against. Other wars, that when the villain isn't nearly as clearly defined, it's hard to make a clear distinction.
Well, it's also really hard to define, like, at what point is it acceptable anymore? And the other thing too is that World War II is really the last traditional war that we had outside of like the Cold War, where you had a clearly defined enemy, and not even just in the sense of like their uniforms are stark. I mean literally like an upstanding military.
Yes.
Consider We Were Soldiers. We Were Soldiers is a very popular film of the Vietnam War. It's one of the only films of the Vietnam War really that stick out because it shows the American military going up against the actual NVA, not just the Viet Cong, but the actual like North Vietnamese military forces.
Yes.
It shows battle tactics. It shows things that we can learn from it. It shows the plight and the struggle that are happening on the battlefield. Most Vietnam movies tend to focus on how nuanced war can actually be and how difficult the war was. Or it's very, very open-ended. Like, it's very open-ended. Like,
yes.
Usually Vietnam shows up as a flashback because most people in that era were drafted into Vietnam, and as a result it became very like it was a cultural thing that everybody just kind of accepted. Okay, you're a teenage male in the 1960s, you probably went to Vietnam for a short stint.
Yes.
And so they have the obligatory scene, but it doesn't really dive into it because Vietnam is probably one of the most complicated wars because it was the first one where we were fighting an actual like terrorist organization and a resistance movement among the people that was hiding among the people.
Yes. It was our first foreign guerrilla fight. Up to that point, the only time guerrilla tactics were used in war we had to deal with was our own.
Right. And so it gets harder to actually like film a no-kidding Vietnam movie without hitting just the 3 or 4 specific famous scenes that everybody remembers.
I like that point that you made about the Viet Cong. That's one of those things about the nuance of war. Like there was an actual legitimate organized military we fought in Vietnam. Nobody really remembers or thinks about that because they mostly used the Southern Viet Cong as their way to keep us at bay. But had we were so busy fighting that the people got paranoid and started attacking civilians out of necessity. Like literally, like it was the first war we fought against the people that were like dressing civilians as soldiers and tricking us and like catching our people by surprise. We weren't ready for that kind of warfare. And we weren't willing to fight it. Like we didn't have the stomach for it. We're killing civilians. Yeah. But had they just gone and just taken out the Northern Army, but they were too afraid to get too close to China and poke the bear.
Yeah.
So they did. Basically, we were fighting a proxy war against communism, but also a proxy war. That's how many layers were in that war. It's so complex.
Yeah.
But people simplified it to, we just shouldn't have been there. But that's a misnomer. That's not helpful. And a lot of films kind of don't want to talk about it because, like you said, that's not easy. It's not easy to make a clear defined villain out of this. It's not easy to show the nuances. So we're just not going to do anything with it at all.
Well, yeah, and there's
World War II is so much simpler, so much easier.
Well, yeah, and the other thing too is that Vietnam spanned a very long period of time, but because it is so nuanced and it was just a day-to-day struggle, it's hard to really have very defining moments to pick to film.
Yep.
So there's very few Vietnam movies out there. Probably one of the most popular ones is Good Morning Vietnam, which is a fictional story based in Vietnam, but it gets into this idea of how hard it was, because literally they're just in a Vietnamese village near a base, and the Viet Cong is among the people. In fact, one of the people that Robin Williams' character is actually friends with joins the Viet Cong because he doesn't want the Americans there anymore. Not because he hates, Robin Williams and those Americans. He just hates that America's here in general. So it gets into that. But there's very few opportunities, I think, within Vietnam to write very good, compelling war stories. It's mainly you kind of have like 3 storylines that you can really go with.
Yes.
Whereas World War II, you have a 6-year period. You can look at it from 2 different fronts. Well, actually 3 different fronts. You have the European front. Well, you have even more than that, actually, now that I think about it. You have Africa. You have the Western front in Europe. You have the Eastern front in Europe. You have the Pacific, and all the battles are taking place in the Pacific.
Yep.
There's so much source material that you can do. And the other thing is, because it's such a long period of time and so much things changed over the course of that time, and all of the different armies were doing so many different things happening around those times, you have a lot of things that you can pull from, and you can easily make a fiction film. Because think about Overlord, the movie that I think J.J. Abrams was behind it.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Overlord is a 100% fictional story, but it's about essentially the Nazis trying to make super soldiers during the time of Operation Overlord, and a small group of commandos is tasked with going to this secret facility and stopping this experimentation. But they get caught up by like the evil mad scientists and stuff like that. It's an interesting film.
That sounds like fun.
But see, like, you can easily do that. You can easily make a film that has this wild, crazy premise and set it in World War II, and technically it's a World War II film. And people can identify quickly and be like, oh, I could totally see the Nazis having a mad scientist who's trying to make super soldiers. And he just so happens to be within aircraft range of the Normandy landings. Right? It's still relatively believable. So I think that it's just a thing of there's a wideness to your ability to make films based in World War II. Because you can take it from a civilian perspective. You can take it from the enemy perspective. You can take it from the Russian perspective.
And you have the 2 totally different fronts that we fought in, the European front and the Pacific front, too.
Yeah, that's what...
There's just so many options.
Yeah, so I think it's just a thing of source material availability. And also, it is one of those eras in time that people find fascinating because you're dealing with not just 1, but 2 clearly dangerous powers that did not care about the people they were invading. And they both had this idea that they could conquer. So, yeah, I think I think we have thoroughly covered why World War II in that era specifically, and why Hollywood seems to have a fixation with those kind of films. Unless you have anything else to say about that.
Nope, that was it for me.
All right. Next question. Will Hollywood move away from World War II? We've already kind of discussed it a bit. Personally, I say no. I don't think we'll move away from World War II until there's another major.
I actually think we will, but for not the reasons you think. I think what will happen is the World War II will become far enough away eventually that it'll be just like any other war of history. Because we already talked about Napoleon.
That's fair.
Napoleon had a movie made of him recently, because Napoleon is an interesting character similar to Hitler, where it was a European expansion and he had grand goals, and he was thought of as a tyrant, but also as a people loved him and they hated him. There was so much nuance the way Europe treated him and saw him. Like, they appeased him at first, but then fought a war out of necessity. There's a lot of parallels between him and Hitler. And he's not even the first. There's even older. You go back to like Genghis Khan, and there's a lot of conquerors that had very interesting ways and strategies and ways they did things. that we don't do a lot of movies about. I think as we get further away from World War II, it won't be as strong a premise anymore. It'll become just like any other historical film. But not just that, it'll also depend on whether or not we have another dictatorial leader who does something like that again. If it happens again, or if we have another massive world war, then films may change to what they go to.
Yeah,
that's what it will take, because World War II that's why World War II is so popular. They've been making films in that war since the war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're getting close to 100 years since World War II.
Well, yeah, like 16.
Yeah.
We're 16 years from the start of the century.
So literally, we're 100 years out, and they're still making wars about it. Now, another reason is it's culturally current, right? People talk about, even in modern day, people are like, oh, Nazis, this, that. So they still talk about it. So creating this villain visage of the Nazis makes an easy political target, because people like to equate anything they don't agree with a Nazi, because it's an easy emblem, an easy symbolism. It's something easy to smack. It's physical, it's harsh, and it's real. It's visceral.
Yeah.
And the temptation to keep making films in that era for eternity. I mean, heck, they just recently, I think a few years ago, made a show about Operation Paperclip, and like a bunch of Jewish people were finding the Nazis and like getting revenge on them after the fact. It's a revenge fantasy film against Nazis. And like, though that stuff is still being made. Like, it's an easy villain to make, and they'll keep doing it until either it's so far in history nobody really cares enough anymore, or I don't even know if they can. You have people born in the last 15 years that hate the Nazis with a passion because they're taught to in every bit of media.
No.
Which I get it, but you have people that have lived 4 or 5 generations removed from the Nazis that hate Nazis and don't even really understand like any of the nuances of the war or the history behind it. They just know Nazi bad.
Yeah. Well, okay, so counterpoint, actually, I think that Hollywood probably will not be moving away from World War II unless there is another major world conflict.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I think that even like 100 years from now, they'd still be making World War II films. And I'll make this argument why. So you mentioned Napoleon, you mentioned all these other historical wars and things like that. If you really think about it, though, it's harder to make a film about Napoleon. It's harder to make a film about Genghis Khan. It's harder to make a film about these other historical figures, because part of it is we don't have a lot of lasting material about these people. We have a lot of speculations, we have letters of the time, and we have maybe a couple of eyewitness accounts, but they're all different. And
that's true. We have video footage of Hitler.
Yeah, exactly. We have video footage of Hitler. We know what he looks like. We know what he sounds like. We know exactly what's happening. And we have all of this. We have actual, like, easy to consume historical data on it. And it's also just been written about ad nauseum.
Yeah.
Since the 1940s.
Yeah, that was my other point too. Yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah, just like you said, you need another war.
Yeah.
And specifically like another demagogue, like powerful orator, Hitler-esque character. He doesn't even have to have a similar like philosophy as him. You just have to have somebody that has a strong...
You need a strong bad guy.
Yeah.
You need a strong bad side and a strong good side. And the thing is that obviously we're not advocating for war. War's awful. I don't think that we should be looking forward to war, but it's an inevitability in a lot of cases. But I do think
it's a very inevitability. We've had hundreds of wars since World War II.
Well, no, like I said, it's inevitable. War's inevitable. There's wars going on all the time, and they're starting up everywhere all the time. But I do think that Hollywood is probably going to keep chewing on World War II just because it's almost impossible to get 6 years of world history to the point where you have I don't think there will be a time when somebody literally puts down their script and goes, finally, we've finished it. World War II has everything about it has been written. Everything about it has been scripted.
Well, that's actually another point to will they ever stop? there are so many stories from World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, it went on for so many years. I mean, there have been a lot of movies and shows made about World War II. And think about fiction. Like, movies get remade every 10 to 20 years. They remake a film.
Yeah.
You could do that with World War II, too.
Oh, absolutely. They've done it before.
Yes, they have.
Yeah.
You remake a film that's already been done with updated cinematography, updated actors, updated script, maybe more historical data, whatever. But you can keep redoing these things. And they haven't even told all the stories that are interesting to be made.
Right.
Like, there's still stories that haven't been made. There was one they did. It was a documentary series on the relic hunters that did the hunting for, like, the artifacts that the Nazis were stealing.
Right.
There's not really been a lot of movies made about that.
Well, The Monument Men.
Yes.
That's like the
That's
one movie.
a lot.
Yeah, that's not a lot.
But like, the assassination of Hitler's been done like 40 times.
Yeah.
Project Valkyrie alone has had 3 different films, an independent film, a full feature film, and a documentary film made about, as well as several documentary series, whereas like the Monument Hunters got one. Operation Paperclip has been mentioned a lot of things, but it's rarely focused on in a film. Like, there's a lot of things you could really hammer home that get you. And that's the other thing. World War II was also used a lot in fiction writing.
Yeah.
It was used in Indiana Jones. It was used in a lot of like adventure films that would make the Nazis the bad guys. You know, it's been used to death. Heck, they even did, as recently as a few years ago in the Arrowverse, they made Earth X, which was a Earth where the Nazis won.
Yeah, and Supergirl was
Nazi, this is the visceral visual, the visual effect of Nazis is really strong.
Yeah.
And it's really popular to use, and it makes a good villain. And for very good reason. Like, the bigotry, the hate, the destruction, there's a lot there.
Oh yeah.
And it makes for a really good, compelling villain. Especially when Hitler thought he was the good. That's the thing. The best villains think they're the good guy. There's that whole line. You either die the hero or live long enough to be the villain.
Yeah.
Hitler came in and fixed a lot of things, but then just never stopped. Like, comes in and he's like, gets inflation under control, and he's like, and then a few years later, the Jews are burning in camps and he's destroyed half of Europe. Like, if you don't put the lid on your ambitions, at some point they will outrun you.
Right. Human nature, given absolute power, will usually result in awful things for everybody else.
Yes.
All right. Speaking of things that are awful, what kind of World War II film would you make personally? Okay, maybe not awful, but I'm kidding. So if you were given the reins and able to make a World War II film, what type of World War II film would you personally make? I
would like to see a World War II film that in an area that's almost never talked about, and that is the lead up between World War I into World War II.
Okay, so just like
I would do a film that ends with the last year of World War I, and then the middle of the film focuses on like the after effects in Germany and Europe in general, and Britain and other places, but is mostly from the perspective of the Germans, from maybe even a German family, but the Germans themselves, and then Hitler's rise to power and what it looked like inside Germany. Why he was so popular, and then the beginnings of the war and the turning of the tide of the public.
Okay.
Because basically a romanticism film of the pro-Hitler side to its fall. And the reason for that is because a lot of people talk about, they like to compare, for the last, as long as I've been alive, they've been comparing any politician anybody doesn't like to Hitler. And they will use out of context quotes or anything that sounds even remotely like anything Hitler has ever said to pin him to a wall. But one of the things about Hitler in general is it wasn't just what he said. It was the movements he did behind it. Politicians for 100 years before and after Hitler have been saying the exact same things Hitler says, because a lot of the stuff he said wasn't wrong. That's what made him so dangerous. He came in and said, this is why we have inflation. This is why our borders are under control, are at our mess. This is why our economy is bad. He was right about that stuff, but then he used it in the anger of the people to interject his own philosophy and gain control, and then twist his vision to a nightmare against everybody. You can't just take what Hitler is and be like, well, this is Hitler, and look, everybody's just like him. It doesn't work. You have to give context. And I would love to see what it was like, the people watching him and why they liked him, but also very clearly the signs that were there. Because there were signs way before he even ran for office that he was not going to be a good leader.
Right. Yeah.
There were signs like crazy. And people just ignored them because they were just upset. And something to be of note, and what was the most dangerous thing about Hitler is he wasn't the demagogue that came in and won. He was the underdog that beat the demagogue and became the thing that he hated most. If you look at like modern politics in the US, like say you have two presidents running and you like one or the other. One side likes one side likes the other. And they each compare the other side to Hitler. Hitler would be the guy that you were rooting for to beat the incumbent guy, because he's the demagogue guy. If you really, the guy that came before Hitler was hated by everybody because of the way that World War I went and the way the inflation went. The leadership was just, the people were pissed off at their leadership. They were unhappy. And so they brought in someone who was dangerous because they wanted to throw a wrench in the system. And he threw a wrench in the system. I'd love to see that given true justice so that people can see what it was really like to see Hitler rise. And it'd be interesting because you'd see people that hate Hitler agree with him. You'd see people that like Hitler realize that they don't like him. And vice versa. You're going to see a lot of interesting emotions. Holy crap. He's saying some things that actually make sense. Because there's a lot of speeches he made that were really powerful when you get the full context. But they'll always clip them out of context to make him look raving. But there's plenty of speeches where he talked very calmly and normally and ramped up to get to the yelling part. People always think he was just this guy pounding the pulpit. But that wasn't all he was. He was a dangerously charismatic person. He was very good at getting the people on his side. That's what made him dangerous.
Well, yeah, and also just like pointing out the fact that it's like he's like the embodiment of evil and stuff like that, but there's a reason that he got into power, and it wasn't because all of the people of Germany were evil. It's because he was saying things that they were agreeing with in a way that they were following, and then when things started getting radical and actually pointed towards evil, he played the German people into following those ideas.
Yes. And then slowly started to replace the populists with people that we could control.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, it'd be interesting to play the rise of like, kind of like the fall of innocence in Germany.
Yes.
To where they got to where they were, but also making it kind of clear that it's like, this could happen to anybody, but actually understand the signs and understand like why it is that he got where he was. They were not justifying him. We're not.
No.
Yeah.
No. It's showing why.
Show it from the civilian perspective.
The real danger that he was.
Yeah.
And that they romanticize films like Project Valkyrie, which was the soldiers turning on Hitler. But what made all those people join Hitler in the first place? They never talk about that.
Yeah.
None of those films ever talk about. They make it sound like these guys always. Project Valkyrie made it sound like these guys always hated Hitler and they just were waiting for their chance. But that's bullcrap. Most of those people drank the Kool-Aid before they turned on him.
Well, it shows the disillusionment in the main character, Tom Cruise's character. It shows his disillusionment.
Yes, but it doesn't make it very clear that they were all hardcore on-board Nazis before they weren't.
That's fair.
It makes them sound like they were kind of tragically along the line. They kind of twisted a little bit to make them look slightly less Man, there were guys that were totally on board the extermination of the Jews and then finally turned on him. Like, everybody has their line they won't cross, and that line kept moving throughout the war.
Yeah.
Just Hitler kept crossing it, and then more and more people turned on him as he crossed lines. But he still held a lot of the people, even people who knew what was going on.
That's fair. Personally, if I made a World War II film, there's a couple of avenues that I would like to take. One of them would be, I think biographies are pretty interesting, like seeing not just like
specific people.
I think that a movie about like Larry Thorne would be interesting. Soldier of Three Armies, where he was literally fighting the Nazis, and then he was fighting the Russians, and he became a Green Beret. Like that's an interesting story, and I don't think that we cover it a lot, just because it's like, oh yeah, there was a Nazi officer in the Green Berets in Vietnam. We don't talk about that. But that could be interesting. I think like Lieutenant Buck Compton. People would know him from Band of Brothers. He was part of the 101st Airborne Easy Company.
Oh,
but he actually led a really interesting life after the war. So I think he deserves to have a movie based off of him. And even like Dick Winters is an interesting character as well. Of course, they're both covered in Band of Brothers, but I think that they're important enough historical figures to have their own film about them. So I'd say like biography would be really cool to film. Otherwise, I'm all about making like fiction and stuff. One movie that would be really cool to film is actually based off of the book One Last Gasp. It's like a cosmic horror film based near the end of World War II, where the Nazis in desperation are trying to figure out ways to win the war, and they're going into like the mystics and stuff like that for like a literal last ditch effort.
That was kind of the idea behind like Hellboy and stuff like that, is they talk about like the Nazis like push into the supernatural.
Yeah. So I think something like that would be really fun to film as well. But anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode of Cinema Recast, talking about World War II films, TV series, and things of that nature. We would love to hear your thoughts, so let us know what you think in the comments below. Be sure to like this, and if you are on a podcasting platform like Spotify or such, check us out on Entertainment Rebooted, and let us know that you listen to this, and let us know your thoughts about it. We would love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, if you're on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button, share us with your friends. They probably would like us as much as you do. So with that, thanks so much for listening.
Thanks for listening.